When I started my first MSP, I charged $25 per seat per month. That was back in 1999. I thought it was a fair price. And I'd done the math. I looked at the other guys and I came in just a little, well, maybe a lot lower. And you know what I found? I found that 2 years later, my actual cost to deliver was about $20 per user. So I was running a business on a $5 margin per user per month. And I thought I was doing fine.
Well, that sounds about right, Joe. I mean, when we talk to MSP owners, almost all of them know their pricing is off. They feel it, but they don't fix it. And the reason they don't fix it is because they can't do the math. It's not that it's hard. It's just really it's a fear problem. And that's what we're going to break down today.
I'm Joe Rojas. I built and sold 3 MSPs.
And I'm Jeff Loehr, and today we're going to talk about the real reason you're afraid to raise your prices and what to actually do about it.
So let me be honest about what was going on in my head back then. I knew that $25 a user was low. I could feel it. I could feel it. I could feel it in my bones. But every time I thought about raising prices, that same voice that was always yapping in the back of my head kicked in. What if they leave? What if my biggest client walks? And that fear kept me stuck for years.
And Joe, you're describing what we hear from MSP owners constantly. I want to read a quote from the research, some of the research we've done. Paul Stossel from Cybersecurity TX said, and I'm quoting him directly, I think the biggest factor is fear. We don't want to lose a client. And that's it. That's the whole thing right there.
And that's exactly it. And what makes it worse is you start doing mental math. You start working these numbers and you think, if I raise my price is 20% and I lose my two biggest clients, I'm actually going to be worse off. So you talk yourself out of it before you even try.
Right. And that mental math feels rational, but it's completely backwards. And here's why. When you keep your prices low out of fear, you're not actually keeping those clients safe. You're making your business weaker. Lower margins means less money for good techs. Less money for good techs means worse service. Worse service is the actual thing that makes clients leave, not your price.
That at $25 a user, I couldn't afford to hire the people I needed. So I was the one answering every escalation at midnight. And then I was tired and making mistakes. And then I was terrified a client would notice, which made me even more afraid to raise prices. And it's this death spiral that you go in where you're just.
All right. So let's name the three fears, Joe, the three fears that are actually operating here. Because most MSP owners lump them all together as I'm afraid to raise my prices. But there are a few different things going on here. And the first one is I'll lose my clients, right? This is the big one. You imagine the conversation where your client says, that's too much, we're leaving. And the fear is so vivid that it really overrides everything else. And fear number two is I can't justify the increase. I know I've felt that in some of my businesses before too, right? You don't feel like you can explain why you're worth more. You have that imposter syndrome that everybody has, by the way, but it creeps up and you look at your service and think, am I really delivering enough to charge more? And then there's the third fear that my competitors are cheaper. And you've seen other proposals floating around. Someone's always willing to do it for less. And you think if you raise your prices, you're handing out your clients to the lowest cost guy.
I want to say something about that third one, especially. The competitors who are cheaper, he's you 5 years ago. He's running on a $15 margin or a $5 margin like I was and burning out and about to hit the same wall. That's not the business you want to compete with. That's the business you want to stop being.
Okay, so here's the reframe, and I want MSP owners to really sit with this. Your clients don't think you're expensive. They think you're a commodity.
Mm.
And those two are completely different problems. If your clients see you as just another IT provider who keeps the network running and answers the phone when something breaks, then yes, price is the only thing they can compare you on. When you look like everybody else, price is the only thing that differentiates you. You're a commodity. And in a commodity market, the cheapest option wins. But that's not a pricing problem. That's a positioning problem. You haven't given them a reason to see you as anything other than a cost center.
Yeah. And I can give you an example of that, right? In my second MSP, I had a client that was an accounting firm. It was about 30 users, and they were paying about $85 a seat. And one day, their office manager calls and says, "Hey, we got a quote from another provider for $65 a user. Can you match it?" And old me, oh my God, old me would have lost it, would have panicked, would have cut the price, met them in the middle, would have done anything to keep that client. But by this point, I learned something. So I said, let me show you something. And, I pulled up their numbers and I showed that since we took over, their downtime had dropped by 80%. Their help desk tickets were resolved in half the time that they were before. And I identified a compliance gap that their tax software, I'm going to say that again. And I identified a compliance gap in their tax software that could have cost them 6 figures if it got flagged in an audit. I looked at the office manager and I said, that $65 provider will keep your email running. That's fine. But do they know your industry well enough to catch compliance risk before it costs you real money? Not only did they stay, 6 months later, they agreed to an increase to $110 a user.
And that story right there is the whole lesson, really. Joe, you didn't win that conversation by being cheaper, by cutting out bullet points, by justifying why you're a better commodity. You won it by being more valuable. And the only way you could be more valuable was because you've done the work to understand the client's business, not just their network. And this is the fundamental shift. Most MSPs price based on what they do, endpoints, managed tickets resolved, hours available. And that's cost-based pricing. And cost-based pricing will always feel like a race to the bottom. Now, the alternative is value-based pricing. You price based on what your work is worth to the client. If you're preventing 6 figures, say $200,000 in downtime losses, or catching compliance risks, or helping them make better technology decisions that drive revenue, your price should reflect at least a fraction of that value.
And here's where here's the formula we teach. Your price floor, the absolute minimum should be 3 times your direct cost. So if your cost is $50 to service a user, you need to charge at least $150 just to have a sustainable business.
And that doesn't mean that you charge $150 if your cost is $50. That's just the minimum. That's what it takes to survive as a business. There's also the price ceiling, and the price ceiling is much higher. It's the maximum you can charge. And we like to think of it as about 1/3 of the value you deliver, because I don't know, thirds just seem to work well, but it's about 1/3 of the value you deliver. So if your services save or generate, say, $1,000 per user per month for the client, then you can charge up to about $333, and the client will still feel like it's a great deal because it is.
Now, most MSPs will hear that and their first reaction is, I can't charge that. And I want to say, yes, you can. Yes, you can. But maybe not yet, because the math doesn't work, because you haven't built the business that delivers a level of value. And that right there, that's what we need to fix. All right. So let's get practical. If you're sitting there right now, knowing your pricing is off, here are 3 steps you can take right now. Not theory. This is exactly what I did in my third MSP and what we walk our coaching clients through, right? So step one, know your actual numbers. Most MSP owners don't know what it actually costs them to service a client. Not a rough guess, the real number. I'm talking about your fully loaded cost, technician times, tools, licenses, overhead, all of it divided by your number of managed users. When I finally did this exercise at my first MSP, I found out my margins were way lower than I thought. I've heard other MSP owners say the exact same thing over and over again. And that came back to bite them hard, even when they finally looked at the numbers and realized that their profit margins were way low. Always came back to bite them, right? So sit down this week, calculate your true cost per user, then multiply by 3. That's your price floor. If you're charging less than that, you're not running a business. You're subsidizing your client's IT. You're subsidizing it. You're giving them free service.
But I want to add something here. The reason most MSP owners skip this step is because they're afraid of what they'll find. This is a human thing. This actually isn't just MSPs. This is everybody, right? They know the number is going to be uncomfortable. But you can't fix what you won't face. That number is the starting point for everything.
Good. And step 2 is you need to build your value story. This is where most MSP owners get stuck. They think raising prices means just sending an email that says, prices are going up 15%. And then they're shocked when clients push back. Here's what actually works. Before you raise a single price, you need to be able to answer one question for every client. What business outcomes have we delivered for you in the last 12 months? Not that we resolved 847 tickets. Not that your uptime was 99.9%. That's expected. That's what you're going to pay for. That's expected. That's table stakes. That's the minimum thing you can do. What did you do that saved them money, that made them money, that reduced their risk, that helped them grow?
And this is the shift from being a technical vendor to becoming a business partner. And just when you were doing this, you actually could go in and be technical because, people valued that was a different thing. Like you could go in and say, hey, our tickets are closing faster, or you have less technical downtime. And that was valuable. But now things are changing. The way that people are valuing their technical infrastructure is different. So when you can walk into a client meeting and say, in the last year, we prevented X dollars in downtime, like your production line wasn't working, you couldn't do work, right? Or you went in and identified compliance risks, and you could show how the technology supports their growth. In that case, you're not just justifying a price increase, you are demonstrating the value of their investment. And if you can't answer those questions for your clients right now, that's a bigger problem than your pricing. And that's where to start, right? Because it means you're delivering a service without tracking the value of that service, which means you're invisible to the people writing the checks.
Exactly. That's it right there. And this is where strategic business reviews, what we call SBRs, become critical. But that's a whole nother episode. We're not going to talk about that one right now. Right. So step 3, have the conversation. You don't send a pricing email. You have a meeting. You sit down with your client, walk through the value you've delivered, share your roadmap for the next year, and then say, based on what we've accomplished and where we're headed, here's our updated pricing. When I started doing this, I was able to almost double my prices. Later, when I was more confident, I'd go into architects and say, I'm the most expensive MSP you will talk to, bar none, hands down. I charge 3 times more than my competitors. I leaned into charging more by talking about the business benefit that they were going to experience. And the reason it worked is simple. By the time I showed them what we'd actually done for their business, the new price felt reasonable. In some cases, clients said, honestly, I'm surprised you weren't charging me more.
And that moment when the client says, I'm surprised you weren't charging me more, that's how you know you've been operating out of fear rather than value. And the fear was yours, not theirs. And Joe walking into a room and leading with, I'm the most expensive option, is the opposite of a fear-based price. That's confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you deliver. So here's the bigger picture. Everything we've talked about today, knowing your numbers, building your value story, having the pricing conversation, these aren't isolated tactics. They're part of a fundamental shift in how you do business. Most of MSPs are stuck in what we call the workshop model. You're the craftsperson. Everything depends on you. Your price is based on your time and your cost because that's all you have to offer. The alternative is what we call becoming a business solution partner. A BSP prices based on the business outcomes they deliver. A BSP has strategic business reviews that quantify value. A BSP can raise prices confidently because the client sees them as a strategic partner, not a cost line.
And that transformation from MSP to BSP, that's what everything we do at StarGrow Manage is built around. It's not just about charging more. It's about building a business that's worth charging more for.
And so if you're listening to this and thinking, I know my price is broken, but I don't even know where I am right now. We built something for exactly that moment. It's the BSP readiness assessment. It's free. It takes about 15 minutes and it shows you exactly where your business stands across the key areas that we've been talking about: pricing, positioning, operations, all of it. You'll get a personalized score and a clear picture of what to work on next.
So the link is in the description. Take the assessment this week because here's the truth. You already know your pricing needs to change. You know it. You know it in your gut. You know it in your heart. The only question is whether you're going to do something about it or spend another year leaving money on the table, or like we like to say around here, leaving money on the porch. More about
On the
that later.
porch. All righty. Hey, thanks for watching. If this was useful, subscribe to the channel. Let us know. We are here every week with actionable strategies to help you transform your MSP into a business that works for you instead of the other way around.
All right. We'll see you next week.